Lecture XXVII, Attributes of Selfishness. Charles Finney. Desire is constitutional. It is a phenomenon of the sensibility. It is a purely involuntary state of mind, and can in itself produce no action, nor can it in itself have moral character. Selfishness is a phenomenon of the will, and consists in committing the will to the gratification of the desires. The desire itself is not selfishness, but submitting the will to be governed by the desires is selfishness. It should be understood that no kind of mere desire and no strength of mere desire constitute selfishness. Selfishness commences when the will yields to the desire and seeks to obey it, in opposition to the law of the intelligence. It matters not what kind of desire it is. If it is the desire that governs the will, this is selfishness. It must be the will in a state of committal to the gratification of the desire. The desire is not free, but the choice to gratify it is and must be free. The mind knows its obligation to make an opposite choice. It is not a mistake. It is not a choice made in ignorance of moral obligation to choose the highest good of being, as an end, in opposition to self-gratification. It is an intelligent choice in the sense that it is a known resistance of the demands of the intellect. Selfishness consists in this. It is a dethroning of reason from the seat of government, and an enthroning of blind desire in opposition to it. Selfishness consists in the will's yielding itself to the impulses of the sensibility, in opposition to the demands of the intelligence. Book Understanding Sensibility, Charles Finney's Clear Teaching ***. Section 1. The foundation, sin is in the will, not in the feelings. Charles Finney made a very sharp and consistent distinction between temptation in the sensibility, that is, feelings, desires, impulses, and sin in the will, that is, choice, consent, intention. His entire moral theology rests on this distinction. Here is his view clearly explained in his own framework. Finney defined sin very precisely. Sin is the will's choice of self-gratification as the supreme end, instead of choosing God and the good of being. This means, sin is not a sensation. Sin is not a feeling. Sin is not an involuntary desire. Sin is not a spontaneous impression. Sin is always a voluntary choice, a consent of the will, an intention. He wrote in Lectures on Systematic Theology. Moral character belongs to the will. The sensibility is involuntary and has no moral character in itself. The sensibility, feelings, desires, emotional pulls, is morally neutral until the will responds. Section 2. The sensibility produces desires automatically. These are not sin ***. Finney divided human nature into two main faculties. First, the sensibility, involuntary. This includes feelings, emotions, desires, impulses, attractions, aversions, impressions. These arise automatically in response to stimuli. Finney wrote, "Desire belongs to the sensibility, it is not in itself sinful." Examples in Finney's framework: feeling pride rise, feeling sexual attraction, feeling anger rise, feeling selfish impulses, feeling resentment, feeling fear, feeling vanity. These are not yet sin. They are temptations presented to the will. Second, the will, voluntary. The will decides whether to resist, whether to indulge, whether to consent, whether to act on the desire. This is where sin or holiness occurs. Finney said, "All sin consists in voluntary selfishness, not involuntary feeling, voluntary selfishness." Section 3. Temptation becomes sin only when the will consents. This is the key dividing line. Temptation equals desire presented. Sin equals will embracing that desire. Finney would distinguish the stages like this. Stage 1. Desire arises, not sin. Example: you feel pride arise. You feel attraction. You feel selfishness. You feel the urge to exalt yourself. This is temptation, no sin yet. Stage 2. The will rejects the desire, not sin. This is holiness. You say inwardly, "No, I refuse this. I choose humility. I choose God." This is obedience. Even if the feeling continues, there is no sin. Finney explicitly taught that feelings may continue without guilt if the will refuses them. Stage 3, the will consents to the desire. This is sin. Sin begins the moment the will says yes. Not necessarily outwardly, inward consent is enough. Examples of consent: embracing the pride, agreeing with the selfish impulse, indulging the thought, choosing self-gratification inwardly. This is sin even if no outward action occurs, because the will has chosen self as supreme end. Section 4. Finney explicitly rejected the idea that involuntary desires are sinful ***. He strongly opposed the doctrine that sinful nature itself is sin. He wrote, "The sensibility acts necessarily and involuntarily, its states are not sins. And there can be no sin without voluntary transgression." Meaning, you cannot be guilty for what you did not choose. Only what the will chooses carries moral guilt. Section 5. Christ himself experienced temptation in the sensibility, but never sinned. Finney pointed to Christ as proof. Christ experienced hunger, distress, sorrow, temptation, yet never sinned. Why? Because his will never consented. This proves temptation in feeling is not sin. Section 6. Pride, selfishness, lust, etc. exist in two forms in Finney's framework ***. Form 1 as involuntary feeling, not sin. Example: you feel pride rise suddenly. This is temptation, not sin. Form 2 as voluntary intention, sin. Example: you embrace the pride. You choose self-exaltation. Now it is sin, because the will has chosen self as supreme. Section 7. The will has full power to resist temptation, regardless of feelings. Finney strongly emphasized this. The will is not controlled by feelings. Feelings influence but do not determine the will. He wrote, "The will is free, it is not necessitated by the sensibility." Meaning, no matter how strong the desire feels, the will can refuse it. This is moral freedom. Section 8. The presence of temptation does not indicate a sinful heart. Consent does ***. Finney would say, temptation proves you are human. Consent determines your character. Two people may feel the same temptation. One resists right arrow wholly. One consents right arrow sin. The difference is the will. Section 9. The true test of the heart is the governing choice of the will ***. Finney taught that the heart is defined by the supreme intention, not passing feelings. If the will is set on pleasing God as the supreme end, the person is obedient, even if contrary feelings arise. Section 10. Sin is fundamentally choosing self as the supreme end ***. This is Finney's central definition. Not feeling self-interest. Choosing self-interest as supreme. That choice can be outward, inward, conscious, deliberate, but it must involve consent. Summary: Finney's clear distinction. Temptation, not sin. Involuntary desires. Feelings, impressions, emotional pulls. Pride rising involuntarily. Attraction arising involuntarily. These belong to the sensibility. Sin, consent of the will. Choosing selfish gratification. Embracing pride. Indulging the desire. Choosing self over God. Sin belongs to the will. Finney's simplest statement of the difference. Temptation equals desire presented to the will. Sin equals will consenting to the desire. One sentence summary in Finney's exact framework. The sensibility may feel temptation involuntarily, but sin exists only when the will voluntarily chooses self-gratification, instead of choosing God as the supreme end. Section 11. Where do these tempting desires come from if the will is set on God? According to Charles Finney, tempting desires, feelings, and emotional pulls do not come from the will if the will is already set on God. They arise from the sensibility, which operates according to natural laws, habit, and external influences, not moral choice. He was very explicit about this distinction. Finney taught that the human mind has different faculties, and the sensibility produces feelings automatically, regardless of the will's present moral choice. He wrote in Systematic Theology, "The sensibility is involuntary. Its states are produced by causes over which the will has no direct control. This means, even if your will is fully consecrated to God, your sensibility can still produce feelings of pride, feelings of selfishness, feelings of fear, sexual attraction, emotional reactions, impulses. These arise involuntarily. They are not the will choosing self. They are responses arising in the sensibility. These feelings come from natural constitutional laws of the human mind and body. God created the sensibility with fixed laws. For example, if something appears pleasurable, right arrow desire arises automatically. If something appears threatening, right arrow fear arises automatically. If something flatters you, right arrow pride feeling may arise automatically. This is not moral choice. This is natural response." He said, "The sensibility is affected by the perceptions of the intellect, and its feelings arise by a law of necessity." Meaning, when the mind perceives something, feelings naturally follow, even if the will rejects those feelings. Past habits can condition the sensibility to produce certain desires automatically. Previous indulgence strengthens certain emotional tendencies. The sensibility can become conditioned. For example, if a person formerly indulged pride, lust, or selfishness, the sensibility may continue producing those feelings even after repentance. Not because the will still chooses sin, but because the sensibility has been conditioned. This is similar to how memory and associations work. These are residual effects, not present rebellion. External stimuli also trigger desires and feelings automatically. Temptation often comes through sight, memories, thoughts, circumstances, bodily states, social interactions. These influence the sensibility automatically, not the will. For example, you may feel pride when praised. That feeling arises before the will decides anything. Then the will must choose whether to embrace or reject it. The body itself influences the sensibility. The sensibility is closely connected to the nervous system and physical body. Physical conditions can influence emotional states. For example, fatigue, stress, hormones, illness, hunger. These can produce emotional states without any sinful choice. This is part of human constitution, not moral failure. Satan and external temptation can present thoughts and impressions, but cannot control the will. Temptation could come from external spiritual sources, but these only influence the sensibility and intellect. They cannot force the will. The will remains free. Temptation presents options. The will chooses whether to consent. Most importantly, Finney taught that temptation can exist even when the will is fully obedient. This is crucial. He did not believe that a fully consecrated person loses the capacity to feel temptation. He believed the opposite. The sensibility continues to function, but the will refuses sinful indulgence. This is the state of holiness. He wrote, "Holiness does not imply the extinction of the sensibility, nor the absence of desire, but the right control of the will over the sensibility." Meaning, holiness is not the absence of feeling temptation. Holiness is the will ruling over those feelings properly. Finney used Christ as the ultimate example. Christ had a perfectly holy will, yet experienced hunger, distress, temptation, emotional agony. This proves that temptation in the sensibility can exist without sin in the will. Christ's will never consented. Therefore he remained perfectly holy. Finney would say these desires do not reflect your present supreme intention if your will rejects them. Your supreme intention is determined by the will, not by passing feelings. If your will chooses, I will please God, then that is your true character, even if contrary feelings arise. Those feelings do not define your heart. Your governing choice defines your heart. Analogy Finney would agree with. A loyal soldier may feel fear in battle. Fear arises automatically, but his will remains committed to his duty. The fear does not mean he has chosen cowardice. Only if he chooses to abandon his duty would fear become morally significant. The feeling itself is not moral failure. The choice determines moral character. Finney's clearest summary of the source. Desires and feelings arise from natural constitution, laws of the sensibility, past conditioning, bodily states, external stimuli, perception of objects, not from the will itself unless the will consents. Final summary in Finney's own framework. If your supreme intention is to please God, tempting desires and feelings arise not from your will, but from the sensibility, which operates involuntarily according to natural laws, past associations, bodily conditions, and external influences. These desires are not sin unless the will consents to them. The moral character of the person is determined by the governing choice of the will, not by involuntary feelings. Section 12. Why temptation often becomes weaker over time. According to Charles Finney, temptation becomes weaker over time, not because the will directly shuts off the sensibility, but because the sensibility gradually comes into harmony with the governing choice of the will through fixed psychological and spiritual laws. He believed this process was both natural and inevitable if obedience is consistent. Here is his explanation in clear steps, based directly on his theology and philosophy of mind. The will governs the direction of the mind, and the sensibility follows over time. Although the will cannot directly command feelings, it can control what the mind dwells on, what the attention focuses on, what actions are taken, and these in turn reshape the sensibility. He wrote, "The will can direct the attention, and thus indirectly control the states of the sensibility. This is the key mechanism. The will cannot instantly erase a desire, but it can refuse to feed it. And what is not fed weakens. Feelings are strengthened by indulgence and weakened by refusal. The sensibility operates according to a reinforcement principle. When the will consents to a desire, attention reinforces it. Indulgence strengthens it. Habit stabilizes it. But when the will consistently refuses consent, attention is withdrawn. Reinforcement stops. The emotional pathway weakens. Eventually, the desire loses strength. He described this as a natural law of mind. Attention is the fuel of desire. The will controls attention. Attention strengthens whatever it focuses on. If attention is withdrawn, the feeling weakens. If the will refuses to dwell on temptation, the sensibility gradually quiets. This happens because emotional intensity depends on continued mental engagement. Without engagement, the emotional response fades. Habit works in both directions. Repeated indulgence creates strong temptation. Repeated refusal creates weak temptation. The sensibility gradually adapts to the governing intention. New emotional patterns form. Over time, the emotional life aligns with the will. The mind gradually becomes harmonized when the supreme intention is fixed on God. When the will is fully consecrated to God as the supreme end, the inner life gradually becomes unified. At first, there may still be conflicting feelings. But as obedience continues, the sensibility comes into harmony. He described this as increasing inward stability, not because feelings are directly controlled, but because they are indirectly reshaped. Old emotional pathways weaken from disuse. Emotional responses are strengthened by use and weakened by disuse. If selfish desires are never indulged, they gradually lose their power. This is because the mental associations weaken. This is a law of mind. He saw this as similar to strengthening or weakening a habit. New desires grow stronger through repeated obedience. As the will repeatedly chooses God, new emotional patterns form. Love for God deepens. Desire for holiness strengthens. The sensibility begins to support obedience instead of opposing it. Finney taught that eventually, obedience becomes more natural and joyful. This process is gradual, not instantaneous. The will can instantly change its governing intention. But the sensibility adjusts progressively. He distinguished between instant change in the will, gradual change in the sensibility. The will can change immediately. The feelings follow over time. This explains why Christ was tempted but remained perfectly holy. Christ never consented. Therefore, temptation never strengthened sinful pathways. His sensibility remained perfectly ordered. Finney believed this process leads to increasing inward freedom. As the sensibility aligns with the will, temptation becomes less frequent, less intense, less persuasive, because the inner life is no longer divided. The person becomes inwardly stable, not because temptation is impossible, but because the whole person is unified in intention. Finney's principle summarized in one sentence: desires weaken when the will consistently refuses to indulge them, because the sensibility gradually conforms to the governing choice of the will through fixed laws of habit, attention, and mental association. Simple analogy Finney would agree with. Imagine a fire. Indulgence adds wood. Refusal removes wood. Without wood, the fire weakens. Eventually, it dies down. Not instantly, but inevitably. Most important clarification Finney would insist on. The weakening of temptation is not what makes a person holy. The governing choice of the will makes a person holy. Temptation weakening is the result, not the cause, of obedience. Finney on strong temptation in the fully consecrated heart. Section 1. Strong temptation can still happen, even when the will is fully set on God*. Charles Finney was very careful to explain that strong temptation can still occur, even when the will is fully set on God, and that this does not mean the heart is divided or that the person is sinning. His explanation depends entirely on his distinction between the will and the sensibility. Here is exactly how he understood it. The sensibility continues to operate independently of the will. Finney taught that the sensibility does not instantly stop producing feelings just because the will has changed its governing intention. He wrote in Systematic Theology, "The sensibility is not under the direct control of the will. This means, even if your will is fully consecrated to God, your sensibility can still produce strong emotional pulls, sudden desires, feelings of pride, fear, attraction, selfish impulses. These arise automatically, not by choice. They do not reflect your present intention. They reflect the involuntary nature of the sensibility." Section 2. Temptation is strongest where the sensibility has been strongly conditioned in the past. Finney taught that previous habits leave lasting impressions on the sensibility. Even after repentance, the sensibility may still produce strong desires because it has been conditioned by past indulgence. This is not present rebellion. It is residual conditioning. The will has changed. The sensibility adjusts more slowly. Section 3. External stimuli can trigger powerful emotional responses instantly. Finney taught that the sensibility responds immediately to external stimuli. For example, praise may trigger pride feelings. Attraction may arise instantly when seeing someone. Fear may arise suddenly in danger. These reactions occur before the will decides anything. They are automatic. They are not sin. They are temptation. Section 4. The strength of temptation does not determine moral character. The choice of the will does. This was one of Finney's most important points. He rejected the idea that stronger temptation means a worse heart. Instead, he taught that moral character depends entirely on the will's governing intention. Two people may feel identical temptation. One consents right arrow sin. One refuses right arrow obedience. The feeling itself has no moral character. Only the choice does. Section 5. Christ experienced strong temptation, but remained perfectly holy. Finney used Christ as the clearest proof. Christ experienced intense hunger, emotional agony, distress, temptation from Satan. Yet he never sinned. Why? Because his will never consented. This proves that strong temptation does not equal sin. Section 6. A divided heart exists only when the will itself is divided, not when feelings conflict with the will. This is critical in Finney's theology. A divided heart is when the will tries to serve two masters. For example, I want God, but I also want self-gratification. That is division. But if the will is fully set on God, and opposing feelings arise involuntarily, there is no division. There is only temptation. The will remains unified. Section 7. The presence of temptation can actually confirm obedience, not contradict it. Finney believed that temptation reveals the will's true governing intention. If temptation arises and the will refuses it, this confirms the will's loyalty. Temptation presents an alternative. The will's refusal proves its allegiance. Without alternatives, obedience could not be tested. Section 8. The will remains completely free regardless of emotional intensity. Finney insisted that no feeling can force the will to sin. Feelings can influence, but they cannot compel. The will retains full power to choose obedience, even under intense emotional pressure. This is the foundation of moral responsibility in Finney's theology. Section 9. Emotional conflict does not mean moral conflict. A person may experience emotional conflict while having complete moral unity. Example: a person may feel strong fear but choose courage. The feeling and the will oppose each other. But the will determines character, not the feeling. Section 10. Finney's clearest summary principle. Temptation belongs to the sensibility. Sin belongs to the will. No matter how strong the temptation is, if the will refuses consent, there is no sin and no divided heart. Simple analogy Finney would agree with. A loyal citizen may feel fear when threatened by an enemy. The fear is real and strong, but his will remains loyal. The fear does not make him a traitor. Only choosing betrayal would. The feeling is not the allegiance. The will is the allegiance. Final summary in Finney's exact framework. Strong temptation can still occur even when the will is fully set on God, because temptation arises in the sensibility, which operates involuntarily according to natural laws, past conditioning, and external stimuli. These feelings do not indicate a divided heart unless the will consents to them. Moral character is determined solely by the governing choice of the will, not by the strength or presence of involuntary desires. Section 11. How to tell the difference between true obedience and hidden consent. Charles Finney gave very clear diagnostic signs to distinguish between true obedience, the will rejecting sin, and hidden consent, the will secretly embracing sin. His test was not based on what you feel, but on what your will actually does with the temptation. Here are the key signs according to Finney's theology. True obedience rejects the temptation immediately, hidden consent entertains it. This is one of Finney's clearest tests. True obedience. The will refuses the temptation as soon as it is recognized. There is no deliberate entertaining of it. The mind does not welcome it. Hidden consent. The will allows the mind to dwell on it. The person mentally entertains it. They linger voluntarily. Finney taught that voluntary entertaining of temptation is itself consent of the will, even if no outward action follows. The key issue is not whether the thought appeared, but whether the will welcomed it. True obedience sides with God against the desire, hidden consent sides with the desire. Finney said the will always takes a side. True obedience. The inward attitude is, this is wrong, I reject this, I choose God. Hidden consent. The inward attitude is, I want this, I shouldn't, but I do. Even if restrained outwardly, the will is siding with self-gratification. This is what Finney called selfish intention. True obedience resists, hidden consent yields inwardly. Resistance is an act of the will. Finney taught that resistance does not mean feelings disappear instantly. Resistance means the will refuses agreement. Hidden consent occurs when the will yields internally, even subtly. Yielding may include mentally indulging, emotionally embracing, secretly wishing to indulge, even without outward action. True obedience seeks to turn attention away, hidden consent keeps attention on it. Finney taught that attention is controlled by the will. True obedience redirects attention, refuses to dwell on the temptation, turns the mind elsewhere. Hidden consent keeps thinking about it voluntarily, replays it, dwells on it. Attention reveals the will's true preference. True obedience is motivated by supreme regard for God. Hidden consent is motivated by self-gratification. Finney defined sin as choosing self as the supreme end. True obedience. The will says, I choose God above this. Hidden consent. The will says, I want this for myself. Even if outwardly restrained. The governing intention determines the moral character. True obedience produces inward opposition to sin. Hidden consent produces inward sympathy with it. Finney taught that when the will is set on God, the person inwardly opposes sin. They do not agree with it. They do not justify it. They do not excuse it. Hidden consent sympathizes with the temptation, even if mixed with guilt. True obedience persists in refusal. Hidden consent eventually gives way. Finney taught that the will's governing intention determines long-term direction. True obedience continues to refuse temptation. Hidden consent eventually yields because the will never fully rejected it. Outward restraint alone is not proof of obedience. The inward intention is decisive. The most important diagnostic question Finney would ask. Not what did you feel, but what did your will choose? Feelings may oppose the will, but they do not determine obedience. The will determines obedience. Finney's clearest summary principle. Temptation becomes sin at the moment the will consents to self-gratification. Not when the feeling appears, not when the thought appears, but when the will embraces it. Simple real-life example Finney would use. Two people feel the same temptation. Person A feels the temptation, rejects it immediately, refuses to dwell on it, chooses God. No sin occurred. Person B feels the temptation, dwells on it, mentally indulges it, sacredly embraces it. Sin occurred in the will, even if no outward act followed. Final summary in Finney's framework. You can tell the difference between true obedience and hidden consent by examining the governing choice of the will. If the will rejects the temptation, refuses to indulge it, and chooses God as the supreme end, there is obedience, even if feelings persist. But if the will entertains, embraces, or inwardly yields to the temptation, there is sin, even if outward behavior remains controlled. Section 12, Finney's warning about scrupulosity, avoiding false guilt *. Charles Finney was very aware that some sincere Christians falsely accuse themselves of sin when they are actually resisting temptation. He warned that confusing temptation with consent can lead to unnecessary guilt, discouragement, and spiritual instability. Here is how Finney would help someone discern this clearly and avoid scrupulosity. Temptation itself is not proof of sin. Finney repeatedly emphasized that temptation belongs to the sensibility, not the will. He taught that many people mistakenly believe, "If I feel it strongly, I must have consented." But this is false in his theology. The strength of a feeling does not prove consent. The only thing that proves sin is the will's choice to embrace it. He would say temptation proves you are being tempted, not that you have sinned. The presence of unwanted thoughts or feelings often proves the will is opposing them. Finney would point out something very important. If you are disturbed by a thought, resisting it, and rejecting it, this itself is evidence that your will is not consenting. The distress itself shows opposition. If the will had truly embraced it, there would be inward agreement, not resistance. Resistance is evidence of obedience, not sin. Scrupulous people often mistake involuntary thoughts for voluntary intention. Finney taught that thoughts can enter the mind involuntarily. These may come through memory, association, external stimuli, emotional triggers. The will did not create them. The will only decides what to do with them. Scrupulosity falsely treats involuntary thoughts as voluntary choices. Finney rejected this completely. The key question is not, did the thought occur, but did the will embrace it? Finney would direct a person away from analyzing feelings and toward examining intention. He would ask, did you choose it? Did you want it? Did you embrace it? Or did you reject it? If the will rejected it, there is no sin, even if the thought was vivid or persistent. Finney warned that excessive self-accusation can weaken spiritual stability. Constantly accusing oneself without cause can produce confusion, discouragement, emotional instability, loss of confidence in obedience. Finney believed this distracts from actual obedience. He taught that peace comes from recognizing the true state of the will, not from achieving emotional perfection. The will can remain fully obedient while the sensibility is in conflict. Finney emphasized that emotional conflict does not equal moral conflict. A person may feel strong opposing desires while the will remains fully set on God. This is not hypocrisy. This is the normal condition of moral testing. The will determines character, not emotional calmness. Finney would say false guilt often comes from misunderstanding the nature of moral responsibility. Finney believed people are only responsible for what they choose, not for what they feel involuntarily, not for what appears in the mind involuntarily, only for what the will consents to. This was central to his theology. One of Finney's clearest practical tests. If you could honestly choose to remove the temptation instantly, would you? If the answer is yes, your will is not consenting. Your will is opposed to it. This proves obedience. Consent involves willingness. Resistance involves unwillingness. He taught that the governing intention defines the heart, not passing mental states. Finney believed the heart is defined by its supreme intention, not by momentary thoughts, not by emotional fluctuations. If your governing intention is to please God, that defines your character, even if opposing feelings arise. Finney would say that wrongly accusing yourself of consent when you are resisting is itself a mistake of judgment, not proof of sin. The error is intellectual misunderstanding, not moral rebellion. The solution is clarity, not repentance for something you did not choose. Final summary in Finney's framework. Finney taught that many sincere believers falsely accuse themselves of sin when they are actually resisting temptation. He emphasized that involuntary thoughts, desires, and feelings are not sin unless the will consents to them. The true test is whether the will embraces or rejects the temptation. If the will rejects it and remains set on pleasing God, there is obedience, even if the temptation is strong, persistent, or emotionally disturbing. Finney's direct quotes and core principles on the will versus sensibility *. Section 1. Moral character belongs only to the will, not the sensibility *. From Lectures on Systematic Theology. Moral character belongs solely to the ultimate intention of the will. The sensibility has no moral character. This is Finney's foundation. Meaning, feelings themselves are not morally good or evil. Only the will's governing intention determines moral character. Even strong feelings do not define sin or holiness. Only intention does. Section 2. The sensibility acts involuntarily and is not itself sinful ***. From Systematic Theology. The states of the sensibility are involuntary and therefore can have no moral character in themselves. This is extremely clear. Involuntary means not chosen. And Finney says directly, they cannot be sinful in themselves, because sin requires choice. Section 3. Desire itself is not sin **. From Systematic Theology. Desire is not itself sin. It is only when the will yields to desire and chooses gratification that sin exists. This is one of his clearest definitions. Desire equals not sin. Yielding to desire equals sin. The will's consent is the dividing line. Section 4. Sin consists in the will's choice of self-gratification *. From Systematic Theology. All sin consists in selfishness, or in the will's choosing self-gratification as the supreme end. Sin is not feeling selfish impulses, feeling pride, feeling attraction. Sin is choosing self-gratification. The will defines sin. Section 5. The sensibility cannot be directly controlled by the will ***. From Systematic Theology. The sensibility is not directly under the control of the will. This explains why temptation can arise even when the will is obedient. Feelings arise automatically. The will cannot prevent their initial appearance. The will only decides whether to consent. Section 6. Temptation is not sin **. From his sermon Moral Depravity. Temptation is not itself sin. It is only the yielding of the will that constitutes sin. This is explicit. Temptation itself is morally neutral. Sin begins only at yielding, not before. Section 7. The will is always free to resist desire. From Systematic Theology. The will is not necessitated by the sensibility. Meaning, feelings do not force the will. No matter how strong the feeling, the will remains free. Therefore temptation itself cannot be sin, because sin requires voluntary choice. Section 8. Holiness consists in right intention, not absence of contrary feelings. From Systematic Theology. Holiness consists in the supreme, ultimate intention of the will. He does not define holiness as absence of temptation. He defines holiness as right intention, even if contrary feelings exist. Section 9. The sensibility follows the will gradually, not instantly *. From Systematic Theology. The feelings will come to correspond with the action of the will. This explains why temptation may persist for a time, but weakens as obedience continues. The will leads. The sensibility follows. Section 10. There can be no sin without voluntary transgression *. From Systematic Theology. There can be no sin without a voluntary transgression of known law. This completely rules out involuntary feelings as sin. Sin requires voluntary choice. Without voluntary choice, there is no sin. Finney's clearest summary statement, combining his teachings. In Finney's framework, feelings arise involuntarily. Desire itself is not sin. Temptation itself is not sin. Sin occurs only when the will consents. Moral character belongs only to the will's governing intention. Section 11. Where to verify these teachings directly. These are public domain and freely available. Systematic Theology, full text, https://www.gutenberg.org/ebook/37698. Lectures to Professing Christians, https://www.gutenberg.org/ebook/37745. Sermons on Important Subjects, https://www.gutenberg.org/ebook/37730. The Oberlin Evangelist Sermons Archive, https://www.truthandheart.com/Oberlin-Evangelist/. Final summary in Finney's own theological terms, ****. Finney taught that temptation, desire and emotional impulses arise involuntarily in the sensibility and are not themselves sin. Sin exists only when the will voluntarily consents to self-gratification instead of choosing God as the supreme end. Therefore, a person whose will remains set on pleasing God is obedient, even if contrary feelings and temptations arise. Section 12. Finney's detailed explanation of intellect, sensibility, and will ****. Charles Finney explains the difference between the intellect, sensibility, and will most clearly in his lectures on systematic theology, especially in the section titled Moral Agency. This is the foundation of his entire understanding of temptation, sin, and obedience. Here is Finney's structure explained with his own definitions and direct quotes. The intellect perceives and presents information. Finney defined the intellect as the faculty that perceives truth, forms ideas, reasons, judges, presents options to the will. He wrote, "The intellect is the faculty that thinks, reasons, judges, and forms ideas. The intellect does not choose. It only presents knowledge. For example, the intellect recognizes this action would please God. This action would please self. It presents both options, but it does not decide between them. The sensibility produces feelings and desires automatically." Finney defined the sensibility as the faculty of feeling. He wrote, "The sensibility is the faculty of feeling. All pleasure and pain belong to it. This includes desires, emotions, attractions, aversions, impulses, emotional reactions." Most importantly, Finney emphasized, the states of the sensibility are involuntary. This means you do not directly choose your feelings. They arise automatically in response to what the intellect perceives. For example, if the intellect perceives praise right arrow, the sensibility may produce pleasure. If the intellect perceives danger right arrow, the sensibility produces fear. These occur automatically, not by moral choice. The will, the only faculty that makes moral choices. Finney defined the will as the governing faculty. He wrote, "The will is the executive faculty. It chooses or refuses choice. And most importantly, the will alone is the faculty of moral agency. This means only the will can sin. Only the will can obey God. Only the will determines moral character. Not the intellect. Not the sensibility. Only the will. The will chooses the supreme end of life." This is Finney's most important concept. He taught that the will sets the supreme intention. He wrote, "The ultimate intention of the will determines moral character. The will chooses between God as the supreme end, or self as the supreme end. This governing choice defines the heart, not passing feelings. The sensibility does not control the will." Finney explicitly rejected the idea that feelings control choice. He wrote, "The will is not necessitated by the sensibility. This means feelings influence, but do not force. The will remains free, even under strong emotional pressure. The sensibility responds automatically to what the intellect presents. Finney explained the sequence like this. Step 1, the intellect perceives something. Step 2, the sensibility produces feelings automatically. Step 3, the will chooses how to respond. For example, you say praise, intellect perceives. You feel pleasure or pride, impulse, sensibility reacts. Then the will chooses. Embrace pride, sin. Or reject pride, obedience. The feeling itself was not sin. The choice determines sin. The will indirectly influences the sensibility over time. Finney taught that while the will cannot instantly control feelings, it influences them indirectly. He wrote, "The will can direct the attention, and thus indirectly influence the sensibility. By choosing what to focus on, the will reshapes emotional patterns. Over time, the sensibility aligns with the will. This explains spiritual growth. The sensibility may conflict with the will without moral guilt. This is extremely important in Finney's theology. He taught that opposing feelings do not mean opposing intention. The will may fully choose God, while the sensibility produces contrary desires. This is temptation, not sin. Sin occurs only if the will consents." Finney's complete structure, summarized in his own framework. Intellect knows, perceives, presents options. Sensibility feels, desires, reacts automatically. Will chooses, governs, determines moral character. Only the will sins. Only the will obeys. Finney's clearest summary quote. From Systematic Theology. The intellect perceives, the sensibility feels, and the will chooses. This single sentence summarizes his entire psychology. Simple real-life example using Finney's framework. You are insulted. Intellect recognizes the insult. Sensibility produces anger automatically. Will chooses either revenge, sin, or forgiveness, obedience. The anger feeling itself was not sin. The will's choice determines sin. Where you can read this directly in Finney's own writing. Public domain full text. Systematic Theology, see Moral Agency section. https://www.org/files/37698/37698h/37698h htm. Specifically look for the intellect, the sensibility, the will. These sections explain everything above in detail. Final summary in Finney's exact framework. According to Finney, the intellect perceives truth, the sensibility produces feelings involuntarily, and the will alone makes moral choices. Temptation arises in the sensibility automatically, but sin occurs only when the will consents to self-gratification, instead of choosing God as the supreme end. The governing intention of the will, not involuntary feelings, determines the true state of the heart. Section 13. Why a fully consecrated will can still experience unwanted desires without hypocrisy. Charles Finney directly addressed this concern, how a person can be fully consecrated in their will, and yet still experience unwanted desires, impulses, or feelings, without being a hypocrite. His answer rests entirely on the distinction between the ultimate intention of the will and the involuntary states of the sensibility. Here is Finney's explanation in his own theological framework, with his actual ideas and supporting quotes. Consecration belongs to the will, not the sensibility. Finney taught that true consecration is an act of the will setting God as its supreme end. He wrote in Systematic Theology, "Holiness consists in the supreme, ultimate intention of the will." Notice what he does not say. He does not say holiness consists in having no contrary feelings. He says holiness consists in the will's governing intention. This means a person can be fully consecrated in their will even while their sensibility produces contrary feelings. The sensibility continues to produce involuntary feelings even after full consecration. Finney explicitly taught, the sensibility is involuntary, and its states are not under the direct control of the will. This means, even after the will fully chooses God. The sensibility may still produce emotional impulses, sudden desires, attractions, feelings of pride, feelings of fear. These do not originate in the will. They arise automatically. They do not contradict consecration unless the will consents to them. Hypocrisy exists only when the will secretly chooses self, not when feelings conflict with the will. Finney defined hypocrisy as a divided ultimate intention. Hypocrisy is when the will claims to choose God outwardly, but inwardly chooses self. But this is very different from involuntary feelings. If the will truly chooses God and rejects selfish desires, there is no hypocrisy, even if those desires appear in the sensibility. Hypocrisy is a choice of the will, not a condition of the sensibility. Finney taught that temptation itself can exist alongside full obedience. He wrote clearly, "Temptation is not sin. It is only when the will yields to temptation that sin exists." This means temptation and obedience can exist at the same time. Temptation occurs in the sensibility. Obedience occurs in the will. If the will refuses consent, obedience remains intact. Christ himself experienced temptation while remaining perfectly consecrated. Finney used Christ as the ultimate example. Christ experienced hunger, distress, emotional suffering, temptation, yet remained perfectly holy. Why? Because his will never consented to self-gratification. This proves temptation does not contradict consecration. The will and sensibility can temporarily be in conflict without moral contradiction. Finney explained that the sensibility reflects natural laws, past conditioning, and external stimuli. It does not instantly conform to the will, but over time it gradually aligns. This temporary conflict is not hypocrisy. It is part of the normal structure of moral agency. The will determines moral character, not the sensibility. The true test of consecration is what the will does with temptation. Finney would ask, when temptation appears, what does the will do? Does it embrace it or reject it? If it rejects it, consecration is genuine, even if the temptation feels strong. The strength of temptation does not determine consecration. The will's response does. Finney taught that emotional harmony develops gradually after consecration. He explained that the sensibility gradually comes into harmony with the will. He wrote, "The feelings will come to correspond with the state of the will. This happens progressively, not instantly. Consecration is immediate. Emotional harmony follows gradually." Finney's clearest summary principle: consecration is a voluntary choice of the will to make God the supreme end of life. Tempting feelings that arise involuntarily do not contradict consecration unless the will consents to them. Finney's simplest illustration, based on his principles: a loyal person may feel fear but still choose courage. The fear does not make them disloyal. Only choosing betrayal would. Likewise, unwanted desires do not make a person unconsecrated. Only consenting to them would. Final summary in Finney's exact framework. According to Finney, a person can be fully consecrated in their will and still experience unwanted desires, because those desires arise in the sensibility, which operates involuntarily. Consecration belongs to the ultimate intention of the will, not to the involuntary states of feeling. Therefore, temptation does not make a person a hypocrite unless the will consents to it. The true state of the heart is determined by the governing choice of the will, not by the presence or strength of involuntary desires. Section 14. How to know with certainty whether your ultimate intention is truly set on God*. Charles Finney gave very concrete, objective tests to determine whether your ultimate intention is truly set on God, as opposed to merely having religious feelings, desires, or impressions. His tests focus entirely on the actual governing choice of the will, not emotions. Here are Finney's own diagnostic principles, drawn from systematic theology, lectures to professing Christians, and the Oberlin Evangelist. Your ultimate intention is revealed by what you choose when self and God conflict. This was Finney's primary test. He taught that your true supreme end is shown when obedience costs you something. He wrote, "The true intention of the mind is shown by what it chooses when duty and self-interest come into competition." Ask, when obedience to God conflicts with self-gratification, what do you choose? If you choose obedience, your will is set on God. Not because you feel like it, but because you choose it. The choice reveals the governing intention. Your ultimate intention is revealed by your honest willingness to obey all known duty. Finney emphasized willingness, not perfection of performance. He taught, if your will is truly consecrated to God, you are willing to obey everything He shows you. Not selectively, not partially, but universally. He wrote, if the will is right, there is a universal willingness to obey God. This willingness is the evidence of true consecration. Your ultimate intention is revealed by what you inwardly prefer most. Finney taught that the supreme end is what you ultimately prefer above all else. Not emotionally, but voluntarily. Ask, if forced to choose between pleasing God or pleasing yourself, which would you choose? Your honest answer reveals your governing intention. Even if self still feels attractive emotionally, the will's preference defines the heart. Your ultimate intention is revealed by whether you resist or indulge temptation. Finney taught this clearly. When temptation arises, the will must take a side. If the will resists temptation because it chooses God, this proves consecration. If the will embraces temptation, this reveals selfish intention. Resistance is evidence of obedience, even if the temptation feels strong. Your ultimate intention is revealed by what you would choose if there were no consequences. This was one of Finney's most penetrating tests. Remove fear of punishment, fear of consequences, fear of being seen. What would you honestly choose? Your answer reveals your true supreme end. Consecration means choosing God for His own sake, not merely to avoid consequences. Your ultimate intention is revealed by your present governing choice, not past failures or present feelings. Finney strongly emphasized this. Your present intention defines your present character. Not your past. Not your emotional state. Not your history of temptation. He taught, the question is not, what have you felt? But what are you choosing now? If your will is presently set on God, that is your true character. Your ultimate intention is revealed by whether you justify sin or oppose it. Finney taught that when the will is set on God, it does not defend sin. It opposes sin. Even when tempted. Even when weak emotionally. The will remains aligned with God's law. Not because of feelings, but because of choice. Your ultimate intention is revealed by what you truly want to be true about yourself. Finney believed this question exposes the will's deepest intention. Do you want to be fully obedient to God? Or do you want permission to serve self? Your honest answer reveals your governing intention. Even if you still struggle emotionally. Finney's clearest summary statement. From systematic theology. The supreme intention, or choice of the highest end, is the whole of moral character. This means, your governing intention defines your character. Not your feelings. Not your temptations. Not your emotional state. Your choice defines your heart. The simplest test Finney would give. He would ask, right now, do you choose God as your supreme end? Not emotionally, but voluntarily. If yes, then your will is consecrated, even if contrary feelings exist. Final summary in Finney's own theological framework. According to Finney, you can know your ultimate intention is set on God if your will chooses obedience over self-gratification, is willing to obey all known duty, resists temptation rather than embracing it, and prefers God above self when honestly examined. The governing choice of the will, not involuntary feelings or emotional fluctuations, determines the true state of the heart. Why a person may still feel emotionally drawn towards sin, even while their will is fully set against it. Section 1. The sensibility operates involuntarily according to fixed laws. Charles Finney taught very clearly that a person may still feel emotionally drawn towards sin, even when their will is fully set against it. He explained this as a normal consequence of how the sensibility operates according to natural laws, which do not instantly change when the will changes its supreme intention. Here is Finney's explanation in his own theological framework, with direct principles from systematic theology and his sermons. Finney wrote in Systematic Theology, "The sensibility is involuntary, and its states are produced by causes over which the will has no direct control. This means feelings arise automatically in response to memories, associations, bodily conditions, external stimuli, past habits, even when the will has fully chosen obedience. The will cannot instantly shut off emotional responses. It can only choose whether to consent." Section 2. Past indulgence leaves lasting emotional tendencies. Finney taught that when desires have been indulged in the past, the sensibility becomes conditioned. This conditioning does not disappear instantly when the will repents. The will can change immediately, but the sensibility adjusts gradually. He explained that this is because emotional responses follow laws of association and habit. The old emotional patterns weaken over time as the will consistently refuses indulgence. Section 3. The intellect continues to perceive objects that naturally produce feelings. Finney taught that when the intellect perceives something desirable, the sensibility naturally responds. This is automatic. For example, if the intellect perceives something previously associated with pleasure, the sensibility produces desire. This occurs even when the will rejects it. The perception triggers the emotional response, not the will. Section 4. The sensibility was designed to respond to perceived good or evil. Finney taught that the sensibility itself is not sinful. It was created to respond to perceived value. It produces attraction toward what appears pleasurable, and aversion toward what appears painful. These reactions occur automatically. Sin exists only if the will chooses self-gratification, not when the sensibility produces desire. Section 5. The will and sensibility are distinct faculties that do not change simultaneously. Finney emphasized that conversion is a change in the will's governing intention, not an instant elimination of all contrary feelings. He wrote, "Holiness consists in the supreme intention of the will." He did not say holiness consists in having no contrary emotional impulses. The will changes immediately. The sensibility follows progressively. Section 6. Temptation requires the presence of alternative desires. Finney taught that moral freedom requires alternatives. If the sensibility could never produce desires contrary to obedience, temptation would not exist, and moral choice would not be meaningful. Temptation presents options. The will chooses between them. The existence of temptation does not contradict obedience. It makes obedience meaningful. Section 7. The sensibility gradually comes into harmony with the will through repeated obedience. Finney wrote, "The feelings will come to correspond with the action of the will. This is progressive, not instantaneous. As the will consistently refuses sinful indulgence, the sensibility gradually changes. Desires weaken. New emotional patterns develop. But this process takes time." Section 8. Christ himself experienced emotional distress and temptation while remaining perfectly obedient. Finney pointed to Christ as the clearest example. Christ experienced intense hunger, emotional agony, distress, yet his will remained perfectly consecrated. This proves emotional experience does not contradict consecration. The will determines moral character, not emotional state. Section 9. Emotional attraction does not equal voluntary intention. Finney made this distinction very clearly. Feeling drawn towards something is not the same as choosing it. Choice belongs to the will. Attraction belongs to the sensibility. The will may fully reject what the sensibility feels. This is temptation, not sin. Section 10. Finney's clearest summary principle asterisk. A person may feel emotional attraction towards sin because the sensibility continues to operate according to natural laws and past conditioning, even after the will has fully consecrated itself to God. These involuntary feelings are not sin unless the will consents to them. Finney's simplest real-life illustration. A person may feel fear when doing their duty. The fear does not mean they have chosen cowardice. If their will chooses duty, they remain faithful. The feeling does not define their character. The choice does. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework asterisk. According to Finney, emotional attraction towards sin can continue even when the will is fully set against sin, because feelings arise involuntarily in the sensibility due to natural laws, past associations, and external stimuli. Conversion changes the governing intention of the will immediately, but the sensibility gradually comes into harmony with that intention. Therefore, unwanted desires do not indicate a sinful heart unless the will consents to them. Section 11. How to weaken these desires in the fastest and most effective way according to Finney. Charles Finney taught that unwanted desires weaken most effectively not by trying to directly suppress feelings, but by governing the will, attention, and habits in accordance with truth. He believed the sensibility changes fastest when the will consistently refuses indulgence and actively strengthens opposite patterns. Here is Finney's practical method, drawn directly from his systematic theology, lectures to professing Christians, and Oberlin evangelist sermons. Firmly and decisively refuse consent every time. This was Finney's most important principle. He taught that the will must take a clear, decisive stand against temptation. Not negotiate, not linger, not debate with it, but reject it. He wrote, "If the will refuses consent, sin does not exist. Temptation may remain, but it has no moral character. Every refusal weakens the desire's influence. Every consent strengthens it. The will is the control point. Immediately withdraw attention from the temptation." Finney taught that attention is the fuel that strengthens desire. He wrote that the will controls attention, and attention strengthens whatever it rests on. If attention remains on the temptation, the emotional intensity grows. If attention is withdrawn, the emotional intensity weakens. This is a fixed psychological law in his system. He emphasized redirecting the mind deliberately, not passively waiting for feelings to change. Positively fix the mind on God, truth, and right action. Finney taught that the mind cannot remain in a neutral vacuum. Attention must move toward something else. He wrote that spiritual strength increases by actively fixing the mind on truth. Not merely resisting error, but actively embracing truth. This strengthens the governing intention and reshapes emotional patterns. Refuse all outward and inward indulgence. Finney taught that indulgence includes not only actions, but inward mental indulgence. He warned that mental indulgence strengthens desire just as much as outward indulgence. He emphasized complete refusal, not partial refusal, not outward restraint with inward indulgence, but full inward and outward rejection. This stops reinforcement of the emotional pattern. Establish new habits of obedience immediately. Finney taught that habit is one of the strongest forces shaping the sensibility. He wrote that repeated obedience establishes new patterns. The sensibility gradually conforms to these patterns. This happens through consistent repetition, not occasional effort. Consistency is critical. Avoid situations that unnecessarily trigger temptation while strengthening new patterns. Finney believed wisdom includes avoiding unnecessary exposure to temptation while the sensibility is still adjusting. This is not weakness. It is intelligent cooperation with psychological law. He taught that reducing triggers accelerates emotional realignment. Strengthen the opposite affection. Finney taught that love for God weakens love for self-gratification. The stronger the governing intention becomes, the weaker contrary desires become. He emphasized cultivating genuine love for God as the supreme end. Not merely suppressing desire, but replacing it. Maintain a steady, settled governing intention. Finney emphasized stability, not constant redeciding, but maintaining a firm, settled intention. When the will remains steady, the sensibility gradually stabilizes around it. Instability slows progress. Consistency accelerates it. Understand that weakening occurs through fixed laws, not emotional force. Finney emphasized that feelings weaken through disuse, not through emotional struggle, not through force, but through consistent non-indulgence. This is gradual but reliable. He taught that this process is governed by natural laws established by God. Finney's clearest summary principle. He wrote in substance throughout his theology. When the will steadily refuses to gratify desire and fixes itself on God as the supreme end, the sensibility gradually comes into harmony and the desires lose their power. This is inevitable if obedience remains consistent. Simple analogy Finney would agree with. A path in a field becomes worn by repeated walking. If walking stops, grass gradually grows over it. If a new path is used, it becomes the stronger path. Desire follows the same law. Indulgence strengthens. Refusal weakens. Final summary in Finney's exact framework. According to Finney, unwanted desires weaken most effectively when the will consistently refuses consent, withdraws attention from temptation, fixes the mind on truth, establishes habits of obedience, and strengthens love for God as the supreme end. The sensibility gradually conforms to the governing intention of the will through fixed psychological and spiritual laws, causing desires to weaken through disuse and replacement. Section 12. Why trying to fight feelings directly often makes them stronger instead of weaker. Charles Finney explicitly taught that trying to fight feelings directly often makes them stronger, because feelings do not yield to direct force of the will. Instead, they are governed by attention, intention, and natural mental laws. His solution was not to attack feelings themselves, but to govern the will and attention, which indirectly reshapes the sensibility. Here is Finney's explanation in his own framework, with his actual principles and supporting quotes. Feelings cannot be changed by direct force of the will. Finney wrote in Systematic Theology. The sensibility is not under the direct control of the will. This means you cannot simply command yourself, stop feeling this, and make it instantly disappear. Feelings arise automatically in response to what the mind perceives and attends to. Trying to directly suppress a feeling is ineffective because the will does not directly produce feelings. It only governs choice and attention. Directly fighting a feeling keeps attention fixed on it, which strengthens it. Finney taught that attention is what sustains emotional intensity. When you try to fight a feeling directly, your attention remains fixed on it. Attention reinforces emotional states. This is a law of mind. The more attention you give to a feeling, the stronger and more persistent it becomes. Even negative attention strengthens it. The will controls attention, and attention controls emotional intensity. Finney wrote, the will can direct the attention, and thus indirectly control the sensibility. This is the key. The will does not control feelings directly, but it controls what the mind dwells on. When attention is redirected, emotional intensity weakens naturally. Without attention, feelings lose their sustaining force. Attempting to suppress feelings directly creates internal fixation. Finney understood that suppression often leads to increased mental fixation. The person keeps checking whether the feeling is gone. This repeated checking keeps attention on the feeling, which sustains it. This prolongs the emotional state, not because the will is weak, but because attention remains engaged. The correct method is to refuse consent and redirect attention. Finney taught that the proper response to temptation is simple and decisive. Refuse consent. Turn attention away. Fix the mind on truth and duty. Not struggle emotionally. Not analyze the feeling repeatedly, but calmly refuse and redirect. This removes reinforcement. Emotional states weaken naturally when they are not reinforced. Finney believed this was a fixed psychological law established by God. Feelings persist when reinforced. Feelings weaken when neglected. When the will refuses indulgence and attention shifts elsewhere, the emotional state gradually loses strength. This happens naturally, without direct emotional struggle. Christ demonstrated this principle in temptation. Finney pointed to Christ resisting Satan by calmly standing on truth. Christ did not emotionally wrestle with the temptation. He simply rejected it and stood firm in truth. The will remained steady. Attention remained fixed on obedience. The temptation lost its force. Finney warned against confusing emotional struggle with moral victory. Finney taught that moral victory occurs in the will, not in emotional intensity. A person may feel strong temptation while remaining fully obedient. Victory is determined by the will's refusal, not by emotional calmness. Waiting for emotional calmness before believing obedience exists is a mistake. Obedience exists when the will refuses consent. The fastest way to weaken a feeling is to starve it of attention and reinforcement. Finney taught that emotional patterns weaken most quickly when they are neither indulged nor fixated on. This allows the sensibility to gradually realign with the will. Attention shifts. Reinforcement stops. Emotional intensity fades. This is gradual but reliable. Finney's clearest summary principle. In substance, throughout his theology, Finney taught: feelings cannot be controlled directly by force of will, but they are indirectly governed by attention and intention. When the will refuses consent and withdraws attention from temptation, the sensibility gradually comes into harmony, and the feeling loses its power. Simple analogy Finney would agree with. Imagine a fire. Trying to fight the fire directly with your hands only keeps you close to it. Removing the fuel causes it to die naturally. Attention is the fuel. Remove attention and the fire weakens. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework. According to Finney, trying to fight feelings directly often strengthens them because the sensibility is not under direct control of the will, and emotional intensity is sustained by attention. The proper method is not to suppress feelings directly, but to refuse consent in the will and redirect attention toward truth and obedience. As attention and reinforcement are withdrawn, the sensibility gradually conforms to the governing intention of the will, and the unwanted feelings weaken naturally. Section 13. Finney's precise definition of what consent of the will actually feels like internally. Charles Finney defined consent of the will very precisely. He taught that it is not a feeling, not a sensation, and not the presence of desire, but a voluntary inward decision to embrace self-gratification as an end. Understanding this distinction is critical, because many people confuse temptation, felt in the sensibility, with consent, chosen in the will. Here is Finney's explanation in clear, exact terms based on his systematic theology and sermons. Consent of the will is an inward choice, not a feeling. Finney taught that the will does not feel, it chooses. He wrote, "The will is the faculty of choice, it chooses the end to be secured." Consent is when the will says, in substance, "I will have this," not necessarily in words, but in intention. It is a voluntary embracing, not merely experiencing a desire. A desire may exist without consent. Consent is choosing the desire's fulfillment as an end. Consent involves inward agreement with the desire. Consent means the will stops opposing the temptation and begins agreeing with it. This agreement may be quiet and internal, not dramatic, not emotional, but real. It is when the will sides with the temptation instead of opposing it. Finney defined sin as the will's consenting to self-gratification. Consent is the decisive point where temptation becomes sin. Consent feels like willingness, not mere attraction. This is one of the clearest ways to recognize it. Temptation feels like I am being pulled. Consent feels like I am willing. Temptation presents. Consent embraces. Temptation is involuntary. Consent is voluntary, even if subtle. Consent often includes mentally indulging the temptation. Finney taught that inward indulgence is real consent. This includes deliberately dwelling on it, replaying it voluntarily, enjoying it mentally, choosing not to resist it, even without outward action. Because the will has chosen gratification inwardly. He emphasized that sin begins in the will, not the outward act. Consent removes inward resistance. When the will is resisting temptation, there is inward opposition. Consent removes that opposition. The will stops resisting. It allows the desire, even if outward restraint remains. Outward restraint alone does not determine obedience. The will determines obedience. Consent is always voluntary, never forced. Finney insisted that no feeling can force consent. He wrote, "The will cannot be compelled by the sensibility." This means no matter how strong a feeling is, consent is still a choice. This preserves moral responsibility. Without voluntary consent, there is no sin. Consent is the adoption of self-gratification as the end, even temporarily. Finney taught that sin always involves choosing self as the supreme end. Even temporally. Consent is when the will adopts self-gratification instead of obedience to God. Even briefly. The governing intention shifts in that moment. That shift is sin. Lack of consent feels like inward refusal, even if feelings remain strong. When the will refuses consent, there is a settled inward stance like, "No, I will not choose this." Even if the feelings remain intense. Even if the temptation persists. The will remains set against it. This is obedience, not sin. The presence of desire does not equal consent. Only the will's embrace equals consent. Finney taught that consent is always recognizable by honest self-examination. Finney believed that people can know whether they have consented by examining their intention honestly. Not their feelings, but their choice. He believed the will is conscious of its own choices. Consent is not unconscious. It is a real inward decision. Finney's clearest summary definition. Consent of the will is the voluntary inward choice to embrace self-gratification as an end, rather than choosing obedience to God. Temptation presents the option. Consent chooses it. Without consent, there is no sin. Simple real-life example using Finney's framework. Temptation. You feel pride rise. Consent would be choosing to embrace the pride, enjoying the idea of self-exaltation. Refusal would be rejecting it inwardly, choosing humility. Even if the feeling lingers. The will's choice determines the moral state. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework. According to Finney, consent of the will is not a feeling but a voluntary inward decision to embrace self-gratification instead of obedience to God. Temptation consists of involuntary desires arising in the sensibility, but sin occurs only when the will willingly agrees with and adopts those desires as its end. If the will refuses consent and remains set on pleasing God, there is obedience, even if strong temptation continues. Why consent can sometimes happen very subtly, and how Finney taught believers to detect and prevent even small acts of inward consent. Section 1. Consent often begins as a quiet relaxation of resistance asterisk. Charles Finney warned that consent of the will can sometimes happen very subtly, not as a dramatic decision, but as a quiet inward shift from resistance to willingness. He taught that believers must learn to detect these subtle movements, not by analyzing feelings, but by examining the direction of the will and attention. Here is how Finney explained this, and how he taught people to detect and prevent even small acts of inward consent. Finney taught that consent does not always feel like saying, "I choose sin." Often it begins as simply stopping resistance. Instead of actively rejecting the temptation, the will becomes passive. This passivity is itself a choice. Resistance ceases. The will allows the desire to remain without opposing it. This is often the first subtle step of consent. He taught that obedience requires active refusal, not mere inactivity. Section 2. Consent often shows itself through voluntarily dwelling on the temptation. Finney emphasized that attention reveals the will's intention. If the mind voluntarily continues to dwell on the temptation, this indicates the will is no longer fully resisting. He taught that the will governs attention. So when attention remains on the temptation voluntarily, it shows inward allowance, even if the person does not outwardly act on it. This is why he emphasized redirecting attention quickly. Section 3. Consent often appears as inward sympathy with the temptation. Finney taught that when the will is fully obedient, it inwardly sides with God against the temptation. But when consent begins, the will starts sympathizing with the temptation. There is a subtle inward agreement. Not necessarily full surrender, but a movement toward willingness. This inward sympathy indicates the will is shifting its alignment. Section 4. Consent often occurs before outward action, and even before full conscious realization asterisk. Finney taught that sin always begins in the will. Outward actions simply express inward consent. This inward shift can happen quickly and quietly, sometimes before outward behavior changes. This is why he emphasized guarding the will itself, not merely outward conduct. Section 5. Consent strengthens temptation immediately. Finney taught that when the will consents, even subtly, temptation gains strength. Because consent reinforces the desire. This makes future resistance harder. But when the will refuses consent, temptation weakens. This is governed by fixed laws of mind. Section 6. The clearest sign of non-consent is active inward refusal. Finney taught that true obedience involves a definite inward stance. A real choice against the temptation. Not passive avoidance, but active rejection, even if calm and quiet. This refusal preserves obedience, regardless of feelings. Section 7. Finney taught that immediate refusal prevents consent from developing. The safest response is immediate rejection. Not debate, not analysis, not prolonged attention. Immediate refusal prevents the will from drifting toward consent. Delay increases vulnerability. Quick refusal preserves inward stability. Section 8. Consent can be prevented by maintaining a firm, settled governing intention toward God. Finney taught that when the will remains firmly established in choosing God as its supreme end, temptations lose their persuasive power. The will remains steady. This prevents inward shifting. Stability of intention is protective. Section 9. Finney emphasized honesty with oneself. He taught that self-deception occurs when people ignore or excuse subtle inward consent. Honest self-examination prevents this. Not obsessive introspection, but honest recognition of the will's true choice. The will knows whether it has embraced or rejected temptation. Section 10. Finney's clearest summary principle asterisk. Consent occurs when the will stops opposing temptation and begins allowing or embracing it, even subtly. Obedience consists in maintaining active inward refusal and choosing God as the supreme end, regardless of what feelings are present. Finney's simple analogy asterisk. Imagine holding a door shut against pressure. Resistance keeps the door closed. Consent begins the moment you stop resisting, even if you do not open it fully. The release of resistance allows movement. Maintaining resistance keeps the door closed. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework asterisk. According to Finney, consent can occur subtly when the will relaxes its resistance, allows attention to dwell on temptation, or inwardly sympathizes with it. This may happen quietly before outward action. Finney taught that consent is prevented by immediate refusal, redirecting attention, maintaining a firm governing intention toward God, and honest self-awareness. The key issue is not the presence of temptation, but whether the will actively resists or allows it. Section 11. The difference between involuntary mental replay and voluntary indulgence asterisk. Charles Finney made an important distinction between involuntary mental replay and voluntary mental indulgence. This distinction is critical because many people mistakenly think that the mere presence of a thought, memory, or mental image is sin, even when the will is actually resisting it. Finney would say the difference lies entirely in what the will does with the mental content, not in the fact that it appeared. Here is his explanation in clear, precise terms based on his systematic theology and sermons. Involuntary mental replay originates in the intellect and sensibility, not the will. Finney taught that the mind naturally reproduces thoughts, memories, and images through the laws of association. He explained that when something has been previously experienced, the intellect and sensibility may reproduce it automatically. This is involuntary. It is not chosen. It is not initiated by the will. He wrote in substance that the sensibility and intellect operate according to fixed laws and are not directly controlled by the will. This means a thought or image can appear without any consent of the will. Its appearance is not sin. Voluntary indulgence begins when the will chooses to retain and dwell on the thought. Finney taught that the will governs attention. If the will allows the mind to dwell on the thought voluntarily, this becomes indulgence. This is the key transition point. The difference is not the appearance of the thought, but the will's response to it. Indulgence includes choosing to continue thinking about it, mentally replaying it voluntarily, enjoying it inwardly, refusing to dismiss it. This is consent, even if no outward action follows. Involuntary thoughts often feel intrusive and unwelcome. Finney would say that involuntary thoughts often feel like something happening to you, not something you are choosing. They may feel unwanted, disturbing, or contrary to your true intention. This is evidence that the will is not consenting, because the will does not identify with them. It opposes them. This is temptation, not sin. Voluntary indulgence feels like inward willingness or allowance. Finney taught that consent involves willingness. When indulgence occurs, there is an inward allowance. The will permits the thought to remain. Even quietly, the will stops opposing it. This inward allowance is consent, not the original appearance. The speed of rejection helps reveal the will's intention. Finney taught that when the will is fully set on obedience, it rejects temptation promptly. Not necessarily instantly eliminating the thought, but refusing agreement. The thought may linger in the sensibility, but the will does not embrace it. If the will chooses to dwell on it, that is indulgence. If the will refuses and redirects attention, that is obedience. The will does not control what appears, but it controls what is entertained. This was one of Finney's clearest psychological principles. You cannot always control what appears in your mind, but you always control whether you entertain it. Entertainment is voluntary. Appearance is often involuntary. This is the dividing line. Emotional intensity does not determine consent. Finney taught that a thought or image may produce strong emotional reactions. This does not mean the will has consented. Emotional reaction belongs to the sensibility. Consent belongs to the will. The will may reject something even while emotions respond strongly. This is still obedience. The will reveals itself by what it chooses to focus on. Finney taught that attention is governed by the will. If the will redirects attention away from the temptation, this shows refusal. If the will sustains attention on it voluntarily, this shows indulgence. Attention reveals intention. Finney's clearest summary principle. Involuntary mental replay is not sin, because it arises without the will's consent. Sin begins only when the will voluntarily entertains, embraces, or indulges the thought. Finney's simple real-life example. A memory appears suddenly. Involuntary replay. The memory appears, you do not want it, you refuse it, you redirect attention. No sin occurred. Voluntary indulgence. The memory appears, you choose to dwell on it, you mentally replay it, you inwardly enjoy it. This is consent of the will. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework **. According to Finney, involuntary mental replay originates in the intellect and sensibility through natural laws of association and is not itself sinful. Sin occurs only when the will voluntarily entertains, embraces, or indulges the thought. The moral character of the person is determined not by what appears in the mind, but by whether the will consents to or rejects it. Section 12. Why temptation sometimes becomes more frequent temporarily, when someone first begins consistently resisting it. Charles Finney taught that temptation may sometimes become more frequent or more noticeable temporarily when a person first begins consistently resisting it, and he gave several clear reasons rooted in his understanding of the sensibility, habit, attention, and moral agency. Importantly, he did not see this as evidence of failure, but often as evidence that the will has truly changed. Here is his explanation based on his systematic theology, lectures to professing Christians, and related sermons. Because resistance exposes desires that were previously indulged automatically. Before the will is fully set against sin, indulgence may occur almost automatically, without much internal conflict. Once the will begins firmly resisting, those same desires are no longer being gratified. Now they are felt as opposition. Finney taught that resistance makes temptation more noticeable, not necessarily stronger, but more consciously perceived. Previously there was little resistance. Now there is conscious refusal. This makes the conflict more visible. Because habits that were reinforced in the past continue producing momentum. Finney believed the sensibility follows laws of habit and association. When a desire has been repeatedly indulged in the past, the sensibility has been conditioned to produce it more readily. When the will stops consenting, the habit does not instantly disappear. It continues producing impulses for a time. Not because the will still agrees, but because the sensibility is still operating according to previous conditioning. This momentum gradually weakens as indulgence stops. Because withdrawing indulgence initially causes the sensibility to react more actively. Finney understood that when indulgence is withdrawn, the sensibility may temporarily react more strongly. This is not because the will is failing. It is because the emotional system was accustomed to gratification. When gratification stops, the system continues producing impulses out of habit. Over time, without reinforcement, these impulses weaken. This is part of the realignment process. Because attention becomes more spiritually alert. When a person becomes serious about obedience, their awareness increases. They notice things they previously ignored. Finney taught that spiritual awakening increases moral awareness. Temptations that were once unnoticed or tolerated become more visible. This is not new sin. It is new clarity. The will is now aligned with truth. So it recognizes temptation more clearly. Because temptation presents alternatives necessary for moral freedom. Finney believed moral agency requires real alternatives. Temptation presents those alternatives. As the will strengthens in obedience, temptation may present itself repeatedly. not because obedience is weak, but because moral agency involves continual opportunity for choice. Each refusal strengthens the governing intention, because weakening old desires is a gradual process governed by fixed laws. Finney taught that the sensibility gradually conforms to the will through habit and attention. He wrote in substance that feelings come to correspond with the governing intention of the will. This process takes time, not because the will is incomplete, but because emotional patterns adjust progressively. Consistent refusal leads to gradual weakening, because resistance itself is strengthening the will's governing intention. Finney believed that each act of refusal strengthens obedience. Resistance reinforces the will's commitment to God. This makes obedience more stable, even if temptation still appears temporarily. Resistance builds inward stability, not weakness. Finney warned that increased temptation does not mean increased sin. He emphasized that temptation itself is not sin. Only consent is sin. A person may experience frequent temptation while remaining fully obedient. The presence of temptation does not define the moral state. The will's choice defines the moral state. Finney taught that consistent refusal inevitably weakens temptation. He taught that temptation weakens through disuse. When the will consistently refuses indulgence, the emotional reinforcement stops. Without reinforcement, desire loses strength. This is governed by fixed psychological and spiritual laws. It is gradual but reliable. Finney's clearest summary principle: temptation may temporarily appear more frequently when indulgence stops, because the sensibility continues operating according to previous habits and conditioning. However, as the will consistently refuses consent and maintains its governing intention toward God, the sensibility gradually comes into harmony, and temptation loses its power. Finney's simple analogy: if a wheel has been spinning for a long time, it continues spinning after power is removed. Not because new force is being applied, but because of existing momentum. Eventually it slows and stops. The same principle applies to temptation. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework: according to Finney, temptation may temporarily become more noticeable or frequent when a person begins consistently resisting it, because the sensibility continues operating according to past conditioning and habit. This does not indicate failure, but reflects the gradual realignment of the emotional nature with the governing intention of the will. As the will remains firm in obedience and refuses consent, temptation weakens progressively through fixed laws of mind and habit. Section 13. Why peace and stability increase once the will becomes fully settled in its supreme intention toward God. Charles Finney taught that deep peace and inward stability naturally increase when the will becomes fully settled in choosing God as its supreme end, because the root cause of inner conflict, competition between God and self as the governing intention, is removed. His explanation is very systematic and grounded in his view that the will is the controlling faculty of moral character. Here is Finney's explanation, drawn from Systematic Theology, Lectures to Professing Christians, and his revival sermons. Peace comes when the will stops vacillating between two supreme ends. Finney taught that inner instability exists when the will is divided between choosing God as the supreme end and choosing self-gratification as the supreme end. This creates internal inconsistency. He wrote in substance that a divided will produces inward unrest, because the mind is not unified. But when the will becomes fully settled in choosing God, this division ends. The inner life becomes unified, and peace naturally follows. Peace results from harmony between conscience and the will. Finney taught that conscience affirms obedience and opposes selfishness. When the will chooses selfishness, conscience produces inward disturbance. When the will chooses God, conscience affirms the choice. This removes inward contradiction. The mind experiences harmony. This harmony produces peace, not as a separate act, but as a natural result. Stability increases because the governing intention becomes consistent. Finney emphasized that instability comes from inconsistent intention. When the will repeatedly shifts between obedience and self-gratification, the person experiences instability. But when the will becomes firmly established in one governing intention, choosing God, this instability disappears. The will becomes steady. This steadiness produces inward stability. Emotional conflict gradually decreases as the sensibility aligns with the will. Finney taught that once the will becomes settled, the sensibility gradually conforms to it. He wrote, "The feelings come to correspond with the state of the will. This does not happen instantly, but progressively. As the sensibility aligns with the will, emotional conflict decreases. Peace increases. Uncertainty disappears when the supreme intention becomes clear and settled." Finney taught that uncertainty about one's true intention produces anxiety. When the will is fully consecrated, there is clarity. The person knows their governing intention. This removes internal doubt and instability. Certainty produces peace. Internal resistance weakens because the will is no longer resisting truth. Finney believed that resistance to truth produces inward tension. When the will fully yields to truth, resistance stops. The mind no longer struggles against its own moral obligations. This removes internal friction. Peace follows naturally. Stability increases because the will is the governing faculty of the mind. Finney taught that the will directs the overall course of the mind. When the will is unstable, the mind is unstable. When the will is stable, the mind becomes stable. Because the governing faculty is settled, this brings order to the whole inner life. Peace increases because obedience eliminates the cause of moral conflict. Finney taught that moral conflict exists when the will is choosing against what the intellect and conscience recognize as right. When the will aligns with truth, this conflict disappears. There is no longer internal contradiction. This produces inward rest. Finney emphasized that peace comes from settled intention, not from absence of temptation. He did not teach that peace requires the total absence of temptation. He taught that peace comes from the will being settled. Temptations may still arise in the sensibility, but they no longer produce instability. Because the will is firmly established, the governing intention remains unchanged. Finney's clearest summary principle: peace and stability result when the will becomes fully and consistently established in choosing God as the supreme end, bringing harmony to the conscience, intellect, and sensibility, and removing the internal conflict caused by divided intention. Finney's simple analogy: a compass needle settles when it is aligned with true north. If it keeps shifting, it is unstable. When it settles firmly, it becomes steady. The will settling on God produces the same inward stability. Final summary in Finney's exact theological framework *. According to Finney, peace and stability increase when the will becomes fully settled in choosing God as the supreme end, because this removes the internal conflict caused by divided intention. The conscience, intellect, and sensibility gradually come into harmony with the governing choice of the will, producing inward unity, certainty, and rest. This peace results from moral alignment, not from the absence of temptation, but from the firmness of the will's consecration. How to know when the will has truly become settled versus when it is still vacillating, continued. Section 1. The settled will is marked by a present, unconditional choice, not a past decision or future hope *. Finney stressed that a truly settled will is not something you remember deciding once long ago, nor is it a vague hope for the future. It is a definite, conscious, present reality. He taught that the governing intention must be active right now. You can test this by asking yourself honestly in this moment: is God my supreme end at this instant, or is there still a part of me holding back for self? A settled will answers with clear inward affirmation. A vacillating will hesitates, qualifies, or feels conditional: yes, but. The difference is not in emotion, it is in the honest direction of choice right now. Section 2. The settled will maintains consistency across time and circumstances, asterisk asterisk. Finney explained that vacillation shows itself over days, weeks, or months through inconsistency. A settled will does not swing back and forth in its supreme preference. Look back over recent weeks. Do you see a steady pattern of choosing God's will even in small matters? Or do you see repeated returns to self-preference when pressure comes? Consistency over time reveals a settled governing intention. Repeated shifting reveals a will that has not yet become firmly fixed. Section 3. The settled will produces a growing sense of inward unity and singleness of heart. Finney taught that when the will is divided, the person experiences inner division, tension between two competing supreme ends. When the will becomes settled on God, this inner division gradually disappears. You begin to sense a growing singleness of heart. Not emotional perfection, but moral unity. The mind is no longer pulled in two directions at its deepest level. A vacillating will continues to feel this inner tug-of-war, even if it is subtle. The settled will increasingly experiences, one thing I do, Philippians 3:13, a unified direction. Section 4. The settled will is evidenced by freedom from chronic self-condemnation over motives asterisk asterisk. Finney warned that a vacillating will often lives in chronic self-doubt and self-accusation about motives. The person is never quite sure where their heart really stands. A settled will brings freedom from this constant questioning of intention. You know your supreme choice, even when temptation or emotion is strong. You do not live in perpetual uncertainty about whether you are truly God's. This is not pride, it is the peace that comes from a clear governing intention. Section 5. The settled will shows itself in spontaneous, habitual obedience in small things. Finney taught that a truly settled will does not need constant heroic effort to obey in everyday matters. Obedience becomes more spontaneous and habitual. Small duties are fulfilled without inward debate. The settled will has trained the life around its supreme choice. A vacillating will still debate small matters or frequently yields in little things. The pattern of small, consistent obedience reveals a settled heart. Section 6. The settled will is not afraid of honest self-examination asterisk. Finney repeatedly said that the truly consecrated person welcomes light. They are willing to examine their motives without terror. A settled will can look inward calmly and say, "Search me, O God, and know my heart." Psalm 139:23. They know the governing intention is Godward. A vacillating will fears deep examination because it suspects, or knows, the intention is still divided. Avoidance of honest self-searching is a sign of vacillation. Section 7. The settled will experiences increasing joy in God's will, even in trial asterisk. Finney taught that when the will is settled on God, joy and obedience grows, even amid difficulty. The person finds increasing delight in doing God's will for its own sake. This joy is not constant emotional high, but a deep satisfaction in alignment with God. A vacillating will finds obedience burdensome or joyless because it is still partly resisted.